Hi everybody, welcome back. We're going to continue with the course How to Study. Last time we were looking at what is encoding and how to do effective revision notes or even class notes using the SQ3R system, the survey, question, read, recite, review. Today's lesson, we're going to be looking at primarily what are mind maps, how to create mind maps and how to use them effectively, and certain things you should avoid doing, and also what is active recall and spaced repetition. It's very important to understand those terms because it can help you avoid some of the pitfalls when it comes to revision, some of the things you'd absolutely avoid doing. So we've got quite a bit to get through in this class, and we're just going to jump straight into our handout again. Okay guys, so here is the handout from last time. If I actually zoom out a little just to show you where we are in the handout, it's the actual bottom part of it. So we've already looked at the top parts. If I scroll back up again, our first lesson was on how to do proper revision timetables. Then we looked at advanced cramming. We've also looked down here at the note-taking and what is encoding. That was our last lesson. So today we're going to be looking at mind maps. But before we do, I actually do want to jump into spaced repetition first. That's going to be quite important for us to understand the advantages of mind maps and why you should avoid doing certain things when it comes to your revision. So if we actually just scroll on down to the bottom of the page, this is where we are here. What is active recall and spaced repetition? I'm just going to zoom in a little. Okay, so what is active recall? Active recall, guys, just means to test yourself. You can do this through past papers, practice papers. You could do this through flashcards, or even just staring off into space and ask yourself a question and see can you come up with the answer. Really what you're trying to do is test your memory, test your ability to recall information, and that's the important thing. Not to recognize it, but to recall it without any help whatsoever, without any guides, without your notes, without anything written in front of you. Just being able to come up with the information, to retrieve the information from your memory. So it's different, as I say, to recognition. What's the difference? Recognition versus recall. You can recognize a £5 note, but can you draw it from memory accurately? All the little details that you would see. Well, of course you can't copy it from memory because it's meant to be quite complicated to avoid fraud and to avoid people being able to, create their own banknotes. But you would recognize it. Easily recognize a banknote. So that's the difference. Recognizing something is not recall. And when it comes to your memory and your revision, if you ask yourself a question and you can't think of the answer, you can't get the answer, and then you consult your revision notes and you see the answer, and then you say to yourself, oh yes, I knew that, I recognize that answer. No, you don't know it. That's recall, is being able to recall the information without any help at all. Recognizing the answer, it's one of the practices that students need to avoid. Convincing themselves that they know something when actually they don't. They may recognize the correct answer, which could be handy in some circumstances. If you're doing like a multiple choice test or something, you can recognize the answer when it's presented to you as a list of other possibilities. But that isn't what we're doing for our revision. What we're doing for our revision is being able to recall the information without any help at all. And of course, that's a lot more advanced and that's better. So let's look at the next point here. Multi-store model of how memory works. At first, all information is sensory. Okay, because you are obviously using your eyes, your ears, to hear something in music or to see something written down. So it's all sensory. And for the brain to process that, it tends to be immediately forgotten quite quickly. In fact, your brain doesn't want to overwhelm you. You don't want to be able to see everything around you and every detail around you right now. You probably are not even realizing it, but your brain is blocking out a lot of things right now as you sit watching this video. Like, you wouldn't recognize the pressure of you sitting on a chair. You wouldn't recognize how often you're blinking or breathing or all the different things around you. So all that information is cut down or is cut off by the brain, so you don't get overwhelmed. So that's the sensory part of where information comes into your brain, is through your senses, of course, usually through in music, hearing and seeing the music written down or seeing the notes. Then the next part is working short-term memory, usually forgotten within seconds or minutes later. And of course, when we are encoding, if we remember the last video where we're trying to move information from here into long-term memory, where you may forget it hours to months later. And if you've encoded the information really well, you may never forget it. You know, it goes into super long-term memory and it's always there for the rest of your life. Probably not what you're aiming for the GCSE or A level. You're just wanting to remember this information, you know, 6 months to a year from now, and then you're not too worried if you happen to forget a little of it, if not all of it, because once you do the exam, that's it. Spaced repetition is the system of learning that separates learning and study sessions into increasing lengths of time. Okay, so we use spaced repetition to help us stop this forgetting process. You space out your learning or how often you come back to a subject. If we actually look to see who came up with this, it was actually a German psychologist, Hermann Ebbinghaus, this very famous graph, the Ebbinghaus graph. In the 19th century, he came up with this idea of after you've encountered information for the first time, you tend to forget it quite quickly, usually between 2 to 4 days, this rate of decay in your memory. But if you happen to go back to the information, say a day later, then hopefully you will retrieve that information and put it back up to 100% in your memory. But again, of course, you'll start to forget it almost immediately. You start to remember less and less information. But you can see that the rate of decay is beginning to level off at this point. And then maybe after 3 or 4 days, you go back to the information again. And the forgetting curve is getting shallower and shallower and shallower until maybe weeks, if not months later, your forgetting curve begins to get quite flat. And that's what you're kind of aiming for when it comes to revising with spaced repetition. Is you don't want to be coming back every single day or every week. You want to space your revision out to increasing lengths of time. So 24 hours and 3 days and a couple of weeks and then maybe a couple of months. And here you can see there's actually a model that some students will use, like the 5 times repetition formula. So similar to this, if you go back to the information 1 hour after you've read or learned something, that helps you maintain that information and it helps prevent this rate of decay if you go back to it after an hour. Then maybe a day after you first encountered the information, and then a week, and then a month, and then 3 months after that, until you get to your exam time. You've already then done all your revision. There isn't this sort of last minute cramming or rushing to get all of your revision done within a month or 2 weeks before an exam or even night before. So this is the model that a lot of students have learned over time. So what's the problem? Why do we have to be careful when it comes to spaced repetition and active recall? Don't rely too much on spaced repetition, especially when you're using flashcards. And if you've watched the previous video, you'll know why. We've gone into quite a bit of detail about why you should try not to be too reliant on flashcards. Yes, you are going to need to use them, you are going to need to test yourself, you are going to need a process of active recall, but you don't want to rely solely, completely on flashcards, okay? So don't rely too much on spaced repetition either. Because if you've encoded the information better to begin with, through analyzing it and evaluating it and applying it to past papers, your forgetting curve flattens out to begin with. You should not have to, constantly retrieve the information again and again and again. And you don't need to do as much spaced repetition and revision. You still need to do it, but just not as much. But for a lot of students, you'll find that, they revise something, then they'll come back to it, and they'll come back to it again and again and again and again. There's something wrong if you have to keep coming back to the same topic like 20 times. There's obviously something wrong with your revision. Even if you space it out over weeks and months, there's something not right there. So if you try doing the mind maps that we're going to look at later, it may help, it should help. Why is that? Well, because you're going to be using the left side of your brain and the right side of your brain, the sort of traditional way of splitting the human brain into 2 sides. The left side dealing with numbers, words, logic, the right side of the brain dealing with pictures, color, imagination. If you can combine those 2 ideas, those 2 concepts into your mind map, you're you're using more of your brain power and you're using more areas of your brain to try and remember this information. So this is where the challenging and engaging part of encoding, when we were looking at Bloom's taxonomy in the last video, this is where that comes in, that you're actually engaging a lot more with the material and you're not just, passively reading through flashcards. You want to try and make it as engaging as possible. One of the examples that I use with my students is, and I'll explain to you guys as well here, I want you to have a go at doing this, is I try to get them to imagine that they are outside the front of their school and they see a big digital watch, huge digital watch in the front of their school, telling the time of 14:15, 2:15, 14:15, the big digital watch at the gates of their school. And then they walk through the school gates on into their school, and you notice as they're getting closer to their school that there is a red balloon that's floating in front of them, and the red balloon looks like the number 9, the balloon with the string coming down on one side, so it looks like a number 9, and that balloon is being held in the mouth of a swan, and the swan and its neck will look like the number 2. And then as they get closer to the school, they can hear a party going on, and it's one of their teachers who is 65 and he's retiring, and he's actually being replaced by another teacher who's there as well at the retirement party, and she is 35. So a 65-year-old teacher being replaced by a 35-year-old younger teacher. So what you're looking to do there is try to remember all those numbers. 14:15 at the clock outside of the school. Going through the school gates, you will see the red balloon for the number 9, you'll see the swan for the number 2, and 65 for the teacher retiring, and 35 for the younger teacher taking their post. And really, if you can remember those pictures, this weird, bizarre imagery, this very surreal story, you remembered the mathematical number pi to 10 decimal places. So 1415926535, and you can actually even do it backwards if you can think of it in your head. Okay, so the 35 was the last, so it's now 5356 or 65. That was the swan first, so then 2, and then the balloon is 9, and then the 14:15 digital clock should be 5141. So you can even do pi backwards to 10 decimal places. Don't know why you would need to do that, but it's just an exercise in memory, just to show you that we think in pictures. This idea of combining pictures and also information, written information, it really does help your memory. So if you're able to do that in your mind maps, it really does push a lot of this information into your long-term memory, and that's what we're aiming for. So yeah, this is what we mean by encoding the information. The information that we encoded there for pi, we didn't just write down 3.1415926535 and just stared at the number and tried to remember it over and over again and recite the information. No, what we did there was encode that information better by using imagery and color and a surreal story and combining those images together. So the digital clock, 14:15 outside of your school, or you can do it outside anywhere, it doesn't have to be your school. Wherever it is, make sure that it's somewhere familiar. So 14:15, then as you go through the school gates, you see a red balloon held in the mouth of a swan, which is very unusual to see that. And then as you get closer to your school, you hear a retirement party, 6-5 and 3-5 for the 2 teachers that are there. So yeah, you can come up with your own imagery if you like, whatever works for you. So as long as you encode it well and you can remember the information, that's the thing we're looking for. So if your encoding is pretty good to start with and you're remembering things quite well, spaced repetition is not as effective as people think. The research is beginning to suggest that it's not the best thing. Over the last 10-15 years, there has been a lot of research and books devoted to this, and a lot of YouTube videos, people claiming it's the best thing since sliced bread. So the research is beginning to show that for some students it is. It works better for students who haven't done any revision process at all or haven't developed any study techniques. So of course, as soon as you give them like a system like spaced repetition, you're going to see improvement, you're going to see results. But to be honest, if you had to give them any sort of system, any sort of structure for the revision, they're going to improve anyway because they weren't doing anything to begin with. So it works for students who haven't actually, found an effective revision strategy yet. It's also very boring, guys. I did mention this in the last video, using spaced repetition, because just like using your flashcards, you have to keep coming back to the same information over and over and over and over again, and that can be very time consuming as well. You might have the time to do that, especially coming up to exam time when you've got enough things going on. You may have coursework or practical exams or 4 or 5 exams all happening within the space of a week or two. You're not going to have time to go through the hundreds, if not thousands, of flashcards for all those subjects again and again and again. So there is sort of like a law of diminishing returns when it comes to using spaced repetition and flashcards if you over rely on them. So yeah, you'll find that point of diminishing returns happens when you reach this most productive, and then the effectiveness begins to wear off, and then at some point it actually has a negative return as well, because you may use spaced repetition and you may use flashcards every single time during those separated, spaced out revision times, but that doesn't guarantee that you're actually going to remember any of it. What happens if you start finding that information that you once remembered, you're starting to forget it? So that's when a bit of panic can set in. The things that were working for a while, when it comes to the crunch time where you have pressure and other exams coming up and loads of things happening simultaneously, that you may be putting too much stress and pressure on your brain to retrieve this information again and again and again, and you actually find that you're starting to forget more than what you had maybe 2 or 3 months earlier. So active recall and spaced repetition adjusts the forgetting curve only through repetition. That's the sort of weakness of them, of active recall and spaced repetition. Therefore, you're only working on retrieval practice of memory. There's no encoding. If that is the case, why is spaced repetition with flashcards so popular or so overused? Well, there's 3 reasons, and this is getting into Justin Sung's YouTube video where he has done the research, and he's read a lot of other people's research on why is it that over the last 10-20 years that flashcards and spaced repetition were so popular, and nearly everyone recommends that you do it. And even to this day, type in how to revise into YouTube and you'll probably find that 9 out of 10 videos will talk about spaced repetition and flashcards. So why should we be a little bit wary of them and not rely on them so much? Usually it's the first technique students start with. It's easy to understand and it's easy to get going, and it's the first thing they've heard about, and once they start this way they never change. That's something that I found with my students, guys, is that those students who do the best in exams and who study really, really well, they notice quite early on if something is not working, okay? And they're willing and able to change the revision. They're not sort of stuck in some sort of revision dogma where they're just going to do flashcards and spaced repetition, and it was good to start with but it's not working now, but I'm just going to keep at it, and hopefully it will someday, it will be good again. No, most of the students who get the best results will recognize something that's not right and be willing to make that change. Even if it's a bit scary having to sort of start from scratch, they are willing to do it and approach their topic or their revision in a completely different way. And that really will help. If you're like that as well, if you find there's ways that you've been revising for your GCSE or your A levels and it's not working, do try some of the techniques obviously that we're going through in these videos, and try and make that leap of faith to change and start something new. But you have to be willing and able to make that change. So don't get too attached to the so-called best ways of revising. You can read a lot of books and a lot of YouTube videos, and a lot of people will say this is the way to do it, it's always worked for me, it's always worked. Don't be too quick to jump on the bandwagon. Yeah, so that's the first thing, is that usually it's the first technique students come into contact with, and that means, okay, that's it for now, that's me for the rest of my life. That's the only way I'm ever going to revise, is through spaced repetition and flashcards, maybe highlighting my notes in it or highlighting pages of a textbook. No, these are all pretty bad ways of studying, guys. The second thing is this idea of success bias. When was the last time you heard from someone on YouTube talking about how they failed? Okay, that's what I was saying just before as well. It may look like these are the best ways to revise, because you go on YouTube and type in how to study, and every video at the top 100 videos that come out at you are saying, well, flashcards are the way to go. I use flashcards. These are the best ways to revise. I've always used flashcards and I've got A stars, but nothing but A stars my whole life. Yeah, but remember that you're just hearing the success stories. It's very rare that you're going to go on YouTube and hear somebody say, yes, I tried doing this and I absolutely failed. I was miserable at it. It never worked for me. You know, you tend not to get the negative stories on YouTube, and most people won't bother making a video for something that's failed. So yeah, guys, be careful of the success bias, because you may not be seeing all the information. You may not be getting all the information from people who it hasn't worked for them. For every person on YouTube who says flashcards are the only way to revise, yeah, there's going to be hundreds of other people who'll back that up, but there could be thousands of people that didn't work for them, but they're not going to make a YouTube video out of it. So it also ties in, guys, with this idea at the bottom here, the Dunning-Kruger effect. Confidence in something and knowledge in the field. So confidence from low to high, knowledge in your field of study from low to high. When you first encounter a topic or a subject, you are at the stage where your information and your confidence in something is like, what's going on? Not really sure what we're doing or what we're learning. And as you get a little bit of knowledge in the field, your confidence goes up to very, very high. Oh, I now know everything. And then, of course, the more knowledge you get, you realize, oh, there's actually more to this than I thought. I actually don't know everything. And then as you go even further into it, I'm never going to understand this. You know, this is the panic part. And then eventually, or hopefully, you break through that sort of self-doubt and into it's starting to make sense. And then by the time you get to the end, trust me, it's complicated when you try to explain it to someone. Okay. So yeah, that's where everybody is going to end up, hopefully, in their subject. And that happens over a period of time, from low to high, knowledge in the field, and confidence low to high. The last thing as well, guys, is availability bias. How legit it is based on how common, frequently we encounter it. So if you go onto YouTube, or you see a lot of books in the library or in a bookshop that say, flashcards, how to study with flashcards. Flashcards are the way to go. If you go into like a lot of stationery shops, you'll find that there's loads of space given over to buying flashcards, and even flashcards you can put on a key ring, and software you can buy to automatically create flashcards, and software that automatically tests you through spaced repetition. It has its own algorithm to space out your revision, and they charge you for that. And there's millions of people on Anki and all this. You may think, okay, looks like everybody else is doing it, so this must be legit, if everyone's doing it this way. As I say, don't be too quick just to follow the herd. It may be effective for those people if they keep doing it over and over and over again, but yeah, do you want your exams to be that stressful? Do you want to put yourself under that amount of pressure? Okay, guys, that's our look at active recall and spaced repetition. And just to sum up what we went through there, what is active recall? How is it different from recognition? Remember that when you recall something, you should do it without any visual aid or any aid whatsoever. You should be able to do it completely from memory. Recognition is when you actually see the answer in front of you and you recognize it as being correct. So that's active recall, is being able just to come up with that answer without any help at all. Spaced repetition. What is spaced repetition? It's just this idea invented by Hermann Ebbinghaus, 19th century psychologist, about spacing your revision or your study out over increasing lengths of time. And you can do the 5 times repetition model, where you go back to something an hour after you first encountered it, then go back to it a day, then maybe a week, and then a month, then 3 months, and then hopefully by the time you get to your exams, all your revision is more or less done and you're just doing the final touch-ups, the final little revision strategies just before your exam. So what's the problem with active recall and spaced repetition? It doesn't help us to encode the information. If you encode the information better to begin with, you don't have to do as much continuous retrieval practice of just trying to come up with the answer or find the answer. And it also then is going to save you a lot of time. Really what you should be trying to do, as I said, is try to engage both sides of your brain, the left and the right side. So the left side is all the sort of logical text and numbers, and the right side is the more creative or imaginative or colorful side. Combine the two and hopefully you'll come up with something like a mind map in which your revision will be far more engaging and the information will be better encoded, like we did with the 10 decimal places of pi. It also can be very boring and repetitive, especially if you're just relying on flashcards all the time. If you're bored, your brain is bored, your learning's not good, your brain's not engaged. If you switch off, how are you going to remember anything? Why has spaced repetition become so popular? Well, remember, it's usually the first thing that students come across, and students usually are very averse to switching their study patterns. When they realize something isn't working, they just double down and try to make it work and study even harder and be absolutely determined to make it work, rather than completely changing it up and doing something completely different. Also, you have the success bias. People tend not to, on YouTube or elsewhere, tell you how something didn't work, how they failed at something. Usually they will make a video how they were successful at something, because most people don't want to advertise their failures. So there's a success bias with these things. And number 3 is the availability bias. If you see everybody else doing this, or if that's all you see when you go into a stationery shop, is like loads of flashcards that you can buy, different color flashcards, some of them completely blank, some of them ruled, ones you can even buy for your key ring. And when you go online and when you're searching Amazon or searching YouTube and that's all that you see for books and materials, of course you're going to think, well, everybody else is doing it, then I should be doing it too. It's obviously works. Okay guys, so I've just gone further up the handout here just to go into mind maps. So for mind maps, guys, it's part of this consolidation and preparation that we were looking at before. Remember, if we go back a little from a few videos ago when we were looking at what a long study session is, we've already looked at taking notes and what is encoding. We're actually going to travel down this route now to find out what are mind maps and how to write mind maps. So I was watching a lot of the videos from Justin Sung's YouTube channel. There's probably about 30 or 40 videos that deal with different ways of doing mind maps and all the sort of science behind it. It's fascinating to watch for teachers especially. So I kind of pulled all this information together from his YouTube channel, and I use this with my students now for how to create decent mind maps. So he uses a thing called the GRIND method, G-R-I-N-D-E, the GRIND method. So grouped for the first area, reflective for the second, interconnected for the third, non-verbal for the fourth, directional for the fifth, and emphasized for the sixth. So those are the sort of 6 areas, the 6 sort of rules or guidelines when it comes to doing your mind maps. So let's look at the first one together. Obviously, when you are talking about grouping your information together, perhaps the first 3 ideas can be grouped together as one concept, and the next 3 is another concept, and so on. It mightn't be, and it probably won't be as neat as this. I'm just showing you guys the sort of way of grouping information into little chunks, into little boxes. So whatever way you're going to group information together, it should feel right. It should be intuitive. You should get an idea that this information is related to each other somehow, that they're similar to each other, or they happen at the same time. In the case of music, that these things could all be descriptors or characteristics of theme A or something, that you could bring them together, and it should feel as logical as possible. Okay, so you're grouping or you're chunking information into larger concepts. Think hard about these connections, about what unites them, what makes them similar, and make these connections as strong as you can. Okay, it does take a bit of time to do this because you need to evaluate, define these pieces of information to begin with, and you need to then analyze them to find their similarities, their differences, their compare and contrast. Okay, so that comes under the sort of first idea of just grouping information together. Remember from the last video, information never likes to be isolated, so grouping it together with other information actually makes it more memorable. The second point here, being reflective with your mind maps, should reflect what goes on in your mind. Okay, so it should reflect your thought process, your patterns of thinking, the order in which you've thought about things, Try to be as critical as you can. What is working when you're doing this, and why is it working, or what is not working, and how can you improve it? So when you're grouping the information, or you're first creating your mind map, it should reflect what's going on in your mind about one thing leading on to the next. It should feel right to you. It should feel logical to you. But when you're doing this the first time, you may find that it's quite messy, or you mightn't get it right the first time. You may group things together that actually, after looking at it a couple of times, you think, actually those things don't make sense putting them together, or there's a better way of doing it. Then you start scribbling things out and redrawing them, retrying them another way. So you're never going to get it right the first try. You kind of need to embrace the chaos of this. This is harking back again to the encoding part where we were talking about this may feel uncomfortable. The first time you do it, it may feel a bit confusing, because the first time you do this, it may take you a couple of tries. You may need to do your mind map like 3 or 4 times before you get it perfect the way that you want it to. And you may never get it perfect either, and that's fine. Don't be in a quest to create the neatest, most beautifully written revision notes. You have to embrace the messy, embrace the chaos of it. Usually when you're doing your revision, it's always a process that never really stops. You just want it to be as effective as possible and as good as possible before your exam. But you mightn't get every perfect little thing together, and that's okay. That's not what you're aiming for. So don't be afraid to be messy. If it's messy, still put it down on paper. You can see the mistakes if you do that, and you can see the gaps in your information as well, and you can then start to progressively try to clean it up and reorganize it. Okay, so it's only once you've got it written down that you're able to even do that. So don't try to get it looking perfect the first time. It's not going to happen. When you look for the parts that are messy in your mind map, which means that part is not quite clear in your head, this is what we mean as being reflective. If it looks messy when you've written it down, it's because it's messy in your mind. It actually, though, creates a really high yield focused area for your revision. So you can actually see, just by physically looking at your mind map, oh, this whole area is a complete mess. Well, that means that whole area is a complete mess in your head, that you haven't got it right just yet. And obviously then that's really good feedback for you, because it tells you, well, this is where you need to revise then. This is the area that you need to focus in on. And the other areas may be neater and more organized. Well, then you don't need to do as much with those. Okay, so that's what's really good about the mind map as well, is that the process of creating it actually helps sort of triage your own revision about where you need to do more study and where you need to focus your study. Anything that looks disorganized, has messy lines, messy arrows, or even large gaps, these are the areas to work on, but you need to visually see it. So write it down. So you don't get to see it until you've done it. You need to be able to look at something and think, well, this is an absolute mess, this is chaotic looking. Well, then you need to sort of then focus in on the areas that look really bad and think, how can I better organize this information? That's where your good encoding is happening. It is going to feel confusing. It is going to feel uncomfortable. It's not going to feel like just creating little flashcards and asking yourself a question and then, oh, I got it wrong, and then moving on. It's meant to feel engaging. It's meant to feel challenging when you're doing this. So yeah, this is the part that we mean when you're doing your mind maps, that it can feel a bit, messy, and it should. If it is, you're doing it right. So at least that's something to be assured about. If it feels that if you create a mind map and it looks like an absolute mess, an absolute disaster the first time you do it, then you're probably on the right way. You're probably on the right path. If you're doing it and it feels really simplistic and really easy, you probably aren't doing enough detail, or you're probably missing a lot of things, or you're probably not encoding and evaluating and analyzing the thing properly. So it should feel messy, because you're never going to get it right the first try. Okay, so that's what we mean by reflective. It should reflect what goes on in your mind, and probably the first time you're revising something, it's going to be a mess. Because it is a mess in your head. But that's okay, because you will tidy it up later. So avoid linear notes like a textbook. We kind of already looked at this in the last video when we were talking about encoding, that you shouldn't really be, just writing from left to right on your page of it, in portrait form, one line after another, and then bullet points. If you find that your revision is nothing but a list of bullet points, then yeah, that's probably going to be a problem, because think about it, when you make a list, you're making a list so you don't have to remember anything. If you were to go shopping and you're making a list of things that you want to buy when you go to the shops, you're making a list so you don't have to remember anything. That's the whole point of making a shopping list, is so that you don't have to remember it and you don't forget anything because you've written it down on a piece of paper. But that's not the same thing as having it up here. You've written it down on a piece of paper and it may look very neat and it may look very, organized, but that doesn't help you remember it. Okay, so when you make lists, you're making a list of things so you don't have to actively remember them. Okay, so if you find your revision is like this, where you've just got loads of bullet points, or you've made your revision notes are just completely linear, left to right on the page, and then on your way down, you've written a paragraph, and then bullet points, another paragraph, then bullet points, and then paragraphs and bullet points. You're never going to remember all that information. So break free from that and try and do the mind maps. Group your information and then try to make it reflective of what's happening in your mind, and then avoid the non-linear note taking and follow the rest of these steps. Yeah, so step number 3 then, guys, try to make it interconnected. So maybe concept 1 will lead on to concept 2, or it might get there through another concept that leads you on to concept 2, and then that will lead on to something else. So have like arrows that connect this information together. Make the arrows maybe different sizes, or thicker or thinner, depending on the nature of how closely connected the information is. As it says here, make new distant connections to avoid isolated knowledge and get the big picture. I keep talking about the big picture. So avoid isolated knowledge. So you shouldn't have anything that's out in its little lonesome away, divorced from all the other topics and concepts. Everything should be interconnected. What are the key relationships? Make it more organized as you go. An organized mind map reflects an organized mind. Yeah, so you tidy it up over time. You're never going to get it right first time. It takes repeated attempts, but by the end of it, then you've got it very well organized, and hopefully that reflects what's going on in your head as well. Okay, so interconnected is pretty obvious. You're drawing arrows and connecting information. This one is one that I think most students do struggle with, is this idea of non-verbal mind maps. Don't use too many words like I have, for example, on this handout. This handout's not a mind map, so it's not really comparing like with like. But you don't want to be making lists like I've done here, just one arrow after another or one bullet point after another, and all my information is linear. You don't want to be doing it like that. The way that I've done my notes here is sort of almost like a textbook, because there's a lot of information I need to write down. But if I wanted to sort of remember this information so I don't have to consult it, I would obviously make a mind map out of all this. So don't use too many words. Think of them as a last resort. Maybe if you're doing something like dual coding, where you're combining words with pictures, that's really good. But try to have as few words as possible. Use symbols, use doodles, arrows, shorthand, abbreviations, shapes and diagrams, so all this type of stuff here. So try to use as many sort of symbols as possible to group your information and to represent information as well. So obviously you want to box your information together, and you may make that box a certain shape that represents a certain feature. So for example, all of your harmonic features could be inside of, like a sort of oval sort of shape or circular shape. All of your melodic features could be inside of a square, and maybe all your rhythmic features could be inside of a triangle or something. So it makes it really easy. This is for music, of course, but it makes it really easy for you to see at a glance where all the main ideas are on the page, just from the type of boxes and doodles and drawings that you're using. So try to use as few words as possible in your mind maps. Give your mind maps directionality as well. Use some sort of direction. Give it a specific order. Don't have arrows dodging content. Like if I wanted to relate this part here to say this, I wouldn't do like an arrow like that and sort of dodging all this stuff in between. I want to sort of make sure that similar information is close by to other similar information, or maybe if I wanted to highlight them, a different color or use a different type of box or something to say that this information may be divorced and spread out from other similar information, but at least I can see on the page 2 or 3 things that are similar to each other. So if you're going to use arrows, you don't want to have spaghetti junction of hundreds of arrows just pointing everywhere and crossing each other and going all over the place. It may be just better to use highlighters in your mind maps, or a specific shape or something to represent similar features. So don't have arrows dodging content. You want to try to make it as logical as possible, that there's a bit of a flow to your mind maps. Like A would lead on to B and then on to C, or even better, A plus B would get us C, whatever these topics happen to be, whatever this information happens to be. If I have this and I have this, that actually creates this. Maybe these could be your features that make up a particular theme, and then how does this theme change, or does this theme become the basis of another theme later on? So that's what this could represent, but it could represent anything really. So whatever way you're grouping the information in your mind map into particular concepts, have a directionality to those concepts that they will lead on to other things. So it must flow, it must feel bold and strong. You should see almost like a cause and effect relationship in your mind map. So in other words, it needs to be logical. That's what I said at the start. It needs to have some sort of logic to it, that you just don't have A, B, C, D, and E just sort of scattered throughout a page and there's no relationship to them. There's no attempt whatsoever to find similarities or differences, or how does one thing lead on to the other, how does one thing influence the other or change the other, or how is one thing based on another thing. You want to be able to sort of find those relationships. And the last thing here, guys, your mind map should feel emphasized. So obviously the more important pieces of information are, emphasize them. You can do that through some sort of word art, making it 3D, giving some sort of dimension to the words or to the features and bring them out of the page, almost like making them 3D. You could use thicker or thinner lines for certain information to emphasize its importance. You can use borders or highlighters like I've done here, or all these little things that I've drawn here, all these little boxes, for information to write inside them. So yeah, it just makes it easier and more appealing to look at and more appealing to study. You can use different line styles, dotted lines, thicker lines, wavy lines. Of course, color is vital. Absolutely. I usually tell students, when you're doing your mind maps, if you can make even if you're not grouping information into harmonic, melodic, and rhythmic features, do use one color or something for those harmonic features, or the same chord progression that keeps coming back. Use the same color for that chord progression so that it's easy to see when you look at your mind map. So you can see all the features, all those specific features in one go. So even if you're not going to group them together and they're going to be scattered throughout your mind map, at least have them the same color so you can see the relationship between them very quickly. And of course, use all different types of arrow styles as well, like thick bold arrows or double lined arrows or just really thin arrows, whatever works. Maybe each arrow will have represent some sort of process, or maybe some sort of development or some sort of idea. You are actually thinking about your arrows as well as the information and how to group them together. Okay, so you definitely want to be using all of these in your mind maps if you can. Yeah, guys, so that is the grind method that Justin Sung talked about in his videos. You want to group your information together. Similar information, of course, should be grouped together, and you do an evaluation and an analysis to figure that out. You want your mind maps to be reflective, reflect what's going on in your mind, and being able to sort of see what information you need to focus more on and what information looks disorganized, you don't really fully understand, and maybe find better ways of organizing that information. So that's where you get really good feedback if your mind map is reflective of what's going on in your head. And the third thing, guys, is interconnected. You want to see the key relationships between everything. So using arrows is very helpful for that, and having one thing leading on to another idea or another concept. Number 4 is make your information as non-verbal as possible. So even though you might be doing dual coding in your mind maps where you have text and pictures next to each other representing information, try to rely more on the pictures. rather than the text. You don't want your mind map just to be all your class notes just rearranged into a mind map. Okay, we're going to look at some bad examples later on just to show you what to avoid doing and what you should try and do. Number 5 is the directionality. You should be able to see that there is a logical flow, a direction to your mind map where A and B together creates C, which leads on to D and E, like we saw earlier. So having some directionality to your mind maps is important, where you can see like a beginning, middle, and end, and it just doesn't look like a whole series of bubbles that pointing everywhere, and one thing is there, another thing is there, and there's 20-30 arrows all pointing out to different things. You want to be able to make it manageable, and as if you're going on a journey through your mind map, you should be able to see it, where to begin, where to start, what are the big things, how are things connected to each other. So making it directional is important. And the very last thing, guys, and I think probably the most important thing of all, is emphasize the information. What are the most important pieces of information, and bring that information out through the use of color, through the use of boxes, through thicker lines or different line styles, anything at all that emphasizes the most important features, or at least features that are similar to each other, maybe highlighting those features. Okay, so as much and as many different ways as possible that you can emphasize the big things or the big ideas in your set works. That is the most vital, the most important thing of all, is to emphasize the key information, the key facts that you're trying to remember. Yeah, guys, so there it is, the grind method: grouped, reflective, interconnected, non-verbal, directional, and emphasized. Okay, so that's sort of a neat little summary. If we move into this sort of next section here, some of the laws of mind mapping that when I was reading the Tony Buzan books, he was the guy, as I said before, that Tony Buzan is the guy who popularized the modern version of what we use for mind maps, and he's been doing this for decades, and of course he will sort of give you a really good grounding on how to do mind maps if you are able to get his book. So some of the laws of mind mapping that I found when I went through his books, his publications. Okay, so the first thing is use a blank sheet of paper in landscape. Okay, don't use A4 paper that's lined, the traditional way of taking notes. You need to get out of that and just avoid it. If you are finding it difficult just to find a blank sheet of paper, the best paper that you may have lying around in the house is just printer paper. And then obviously just turn it into landscape position. Make sure the sheet is large enough to allow you to create sub-branches and sub-sub-branches in your mind map. You may find some ideas can be so easily explored that they require their own mini mind map, which orbits the main mind map like moons around a planet. If they can't fit comfortably on the same page, use a new page, of course. But yeah, there may be some things in your mind maps that are quite detailed. So maybe having a wee separate mind map just for the very detailed parts. But try to get it all together into one mind map. It should be possible. Number 2, draw a picture in the center of the paper representing your subject or topic using at least 3 colors. I'm guilty of not always doing that, and you'll see in some of the things that I've done with my students that I rarely will put a picture in the middle, probably due to time considerations. But if I was studying the subject as a student myself, I probably would follow these as closely as I could. As the old saying goes, a picture speaks 1,000 words. So if you have a picture in the center of your mind map to represent the topics that you're trying to memorize, that will hopefully give you a good starting position that's memorable and easy to recall later on. Number 3, use images, symbols, codes, and dimension throughout your mind map. Maybe, for dimension, making some of the words a bit more 3D looking, or bring them out of the page a wee bit, highlight them a wee bit. Yeah, so use as much of those as you can. Select keywords and write these using capital letters. Yeah, that's an obvious way of emphasizing the most important things. When you see a word that appears repeatedly, think about whether this new word can itself be a keyword with its own branch. Yeah, so if you're talking about, say, in music, there may be a particular chord progression or an interval, like a rising seventh or a tritone or something, and you see that occurring again and again and again throughout the same piece, then maybe that idea, that concept of the tritone or the rising seventh or whatever it is, needs to be its own little branch coming out of the mind map. And then every time it occurs, find a relationship to when it occurs. Is it like using word painting? Does it happen during a very dramatic part in the music? Is it happening in the same instruments? Just or in a different key? Just whatever you can to find those connections to make it more memorable. Yeah, so watch out for things that keep popping up and you haven't made a branch for that. If you should, if there's loads of repeated words that keep coming up in your mind map, make sure it has its own branch. Place each new word or image on its own branch so that it stands by itself. Try to use only one word on each branch. Yeah, you can see that here for this mind map for time saving, or when you're trying to organize your time. Aims, dreams, savers, eaters, when. Like there's one word on the branch, and then all the different ideas that come out of it on one or two words per branch type of thing. So that's a very well organized mind map, but yours is probably not going to be as organized as that the first time you're doing it. Of course it won't be, but don't be worrying. This is what you might aim for later on. So yeah, take your time with it. So you can see the use of color, all the different pictures and doodles that are used throughout. Yeah, so there's quite a bit of effort that's gone into that mind map. Yeah, so place each word or image on its own branch so that it stands by itself. Try to use only one word in each branch. It will be easier to remember and will force you to think precisely which word is best. Yeah, so to sort of represent each sort of idea underneath these topics. Number 6, radiate flowing branches out from the central image. Make the branches thicker toward the center of the mind map and thinner as they radiate outward into sub-branches. Again, I'm pretty guilty of not doing that. Usually when I'm sort of teaching mind maps and stuff, I might just use a line. I'll try to use thicker lines, a different pencil or something, but a lot of the time when I'm teaching, it's using an iPad. And some of the apps that I use for doing this don't come with like a greatest selection of, brushes and pencils and things. And some of the apps that I use do. So I need to sort of get into the habit of doing that more myself. You have thicker branches towards the middle and thinner branches towards the outside. There's actually a good reason for this that's discussed in the book, is that it almost looks like a neuron in the human brain. That's what you're trying to emulate, actually, is the very sort of physical way that our brains are made up. You want to try to make your mind maps look like that as well. So there is a little bit of science that's gone in behind this. It isn't just for aesthetic value. Yeah, so radiate flowing branches. Number 7, keep branches the same length as the words or images that are on them. Yeah, so you can see down here, like for some of these branches, that they're only as long as needs be. So don't have a branch that just goes out of your mind map, like, for half the page and there's only a tiny idea connected to it. Okay. Use colors throughout the mind map, developing your own color code. Yeah, as I say, blue maybe for harmonic features, green for melodic, red for structural, whatever you want really that works for you. So match specific colors to your branches or to your ideas. And number 9, use emphasis arrows connecting lines to depict relationships between topics in your mind map. Use chunking, enclosed wavy lines or cloud-like bubbles. That's actually a good idea. We're going to see that in a couple of the examples that I use as well. I think for the AS set work, the Beethoven set work, that I do quite a bit of that as well. So yeah, using chunking and closing wavy lines or cloud-like bubbles to group a set of topics associated to a specific idea. Yeah, so you can not only just group information together onto the same branch for each topic, but you can group branches and topics together other ways as well, so that your mind map becomes highly organized. And that's really good if you can do that. You don't have to. It's just if you see a relationship between certain things, and don't forget to call out that relationship and emphasize that relationship. And the last, guys, 10, aim for clarity in your mind map by positioning your branches in carefully thought through space. Remember that the space between things is often as important as the things themselves. Imagine, for example, the space between trees in a forest. Your brain negotiates the gaps or the space to understand where you are and where you're going rather than the trees. Yeah, so here you can see that this mind map on Macbeth, all the different ideas of the play, the idea of the deviousness of his character, the changes that happen, subconscious, courage, ambition, imagination, the monster. Yeah. So all of that is brought together very sort of colorfully and, you know, quite creative, but there's a lot of empty space around it as well. You know, he filled the page. He didn't try and squish everything or squash everything into a corner or make everything tiny. Fill the page and you have a lot of space around those ideas, so it's easy to sort of read what's going on. Okay guys, so those are the laws of mind mapping according to the man himself who came up with the modern idea of mind mapping, Tony Buzan. So again, as I say, I probably fall at most of those hurdles. I wouldn't stick as closely as I should to those, but if I was revising like you guys are, I would try to follow this as much as possible, because this is the expert, the guy who spent a whole career studying how students from all over the world, how they process information, how they remember information, how they maintain that information, how to transmit it. So it's worthwhile sort of taking on board his points, far more than anything I say anyway. He is the expert at it. I'm definitely not the expert. So yeah, you can see like some of the things here, guys, if I zoom in to sort of summarize that. Yeah, how to mind map. Computer versus hand-drawn. I would probably say that hand-drawn is better. You're actually taking the time yourself. You're doing the heavy work yourself to organize the information, to group the information, and to think hard about things and how they're grouped and how they're written down, how they're spaced out on the page. You don't want to rely on, try not to rely on any sort of automated process, guys. You'll find that things like Anki or some of the mind map things that I've used in the past, programs that help you create mind maps, they take all of the effort out for you, and you might think, oh, that's great, you know, I have a program that does all the heavy lifting and takes all the effort out for me. No, that's the whole point, is that you are meant to, you know, take the time and do it yourself. The effort is the revision. If you have something else that takes over that for you, then you're missing out on what you could be learning and how you would process something, how you would write something and organize something. So if you do your mind maps physically, it's going to be far better than getting a program to do it. And I'd be the first to admit that I have loads of programs that I've bought over the years to help me do mind maps. You may even see one or two pop up in future videos. But it's always better to do your mind maps by hand. Always better. So always be wary of any sort of program that advertises, are you finding revision boring? You know, here we can give you a piece of software that takes all of the boring parts out of the way and you can just get down to revising. If they advertise it as the boring parts and the process parts, that's the parts that you're meant to be doing. So be careful of this. Computer programs that do all of the work for you, you don't want that. Okay, so yeah, you can have a wee look there, and of course these handouts will be available to you guys just to sort of give you an idea of the summary of all the things we were talking about for mind maps. Make them as colorful and as many doodles and as few words, and thicker branches going out to thinner branches. Have words capitalized if you can to make it stand out and easier to read. Yeah, and here's a sort of summary of the summary. Number 1, start at the center of a blank landscape page, ideally with a colorful image to represent your subject. Number 2, use the words and pictures throughout your map. Wherever possible, use single keywords printed along the line. Each word or picture sits on its own line. Yeah, so it just makes it easier to sort of see the information. Of course, you can imagine what we're going to be doing later when we have like maybe harmonic features or melodic features coming out of this, or maybe the concepts that are unique to that set work. That's really good if you can do that and find something that's completely, you know, something that's unique to that set work that doesn't appear in any of your other set works. That's going to be really good if you can get that as a branch. There's going to be a couple of examples I'll show you guys later. Number 3, the lines make the associations between the ideas as clear as possible. Make them flowing and organic. Each line the same length as the word or image. Always ensure that lines connect to the end of the line at the previous level, of course. And typical lines will be thicker at the center and thinner. Yeah, they radiate out. Thinner the further out you go. Experiment with different ways of linking and emphasizing different aspects. Use highlighters. Use color coding and arrows as necessary. Yeah. And the structure that should develop will be a radiant hierarchy with ideas radiating out from your central theme and the main branches. So even how to mind map has been made into a mind map. Okay, so that's kind of a useful wee summary. Okay guys, so that's our little look at mind mapping. So remember the grind method, and also use some of those mind maps that we were looking at as examples of what to follow and what to do. Each mind map will probably look quite different to other mind maps that you're doing as well, and it probably should if you're going to be using unique features, unique topics for each set work, and anything that can sort of open the door to 10 or 20 other topics or, you know, pieces of information. Those are the type of things you want as the main branches of your mind map. So of course we're going to have loads of examples of these guys in future videos of mind maps for GCSE, AS and A2, and I'm going to be doing it for music, of course. But if you're doing a different subject, no matter what subject you're doing at A level or GCSE, all the information we looked at today and previous videos, all of it applies. It doesn't matter what you're studying, even if you're at college as well, it all applies. So there's no sort of age limit to any of these things. But I will be doing it in relation to music, so just to show you some of the ways that I do it. But I do want to cover one more topic before we get into our actual mind maps, and the topic we're going to look at in the next video is flashcards. When to use them and when not to use them. Again, as usual, if you have any questions or you need to get in contact with me, my contact details are in the description below. So also please like and subscribe. It really does help the channel. And yeah, hopefully hear from you soon, and I'll see you again next time.